Government deficits have been going up rapidly, Republican administration or Democratic administration. Why is it that here again you have the difference between pronouncements and performance? There is no congressman, no senator who will come out and say, I am in favor of inflation. There is not a single one who will say, I am in favor of big deficits. They'll all say, we want to balance the budget, we want to hold down spending, we want an economical government. How do you explain the difference between performance and talk on the side of Congress?
Well, first, I think we have to make one point. I'm not so much with the government as I am against it.
I understand.
As you know, I'm a minority member of Congress.
Again, I'm not directing this at you personally.
I understand, of course. And while the administrations, as you mentioned, Republican and Democratic administrations, have both been responsible for increases in spending, at least in terms of their recommendation, it is the Congress, and only the Congress, that appropriates the funds and determines what the taxes are. The President has no authority to do that, and so one must lay it at the feet of the U.S. Congress. Now, I guess we'd have to concede that it's a little bit more fun to give away things than it is to withhold them, and this is the reason that the Congress responds to a general public that says, well, I want you to cut everybody else's program but the one in which I am most particularly interested. Save money, but incidentally my wife is taking care of the orphanages, and so let's try to help the orphanages, or whatever it is. Let me try to make a point, if I can, however, on what I think is a new spirit moving within the Congress, and that is that inflation as a national affliction is beginning to have an impact on the political psychology of many Americans. Now, the Germans, the Japanese, and others have had this terrific post-war inflation. The Germans have been through it twice, after World War I and World War II, and it's a part of their national psyche. But we are affected in this country by the Depression. Our whole tax structure is built on the Depression. The idea of the tax structure in the past has been to get the money out of the mattress, where it went after the banks failed in this country and jobs were lost, and out of the woodshed or the tin box in the backyard, get it out of there and put it into circulation, get it moving, get things going. And one of the ways to do that was to encourage inflation, because if you held on to it, the money would depreciate. And the other way was to tax it away from people and let the government spend it. Now there's a reaction to that, and people are beginning to say, wait just a minute, we're not afflicted as much as we were by depression, we're now afflicted by inflation, and we'd like for you to get it under control. Now you can do that in another way, and that without reducing the money supply radically. I think the Joint Economic Committee has recommended that we do it gradually. But the way that you can do it is to reduce taxes and the impact of government, that is, the weight of government, and increase private saving so that the private saving can finance some of the debt that you have.
There is no way you can do it without reducing, in my opinion, the rate of monetary growth, and I, recognizing the facts, even though they ought not to be that way, I wonder whether you can reduce the rate of monetary growth unless Congress actually does reduce government spending as well as government taxes.
The problem is that every time we use demand management, we get into a kind of an Iron Maiden kind of situation. We twist this way, and one of the spikes grabs us here, so we twist that way, and a spike over here gets us. And every recession has had higher basic unemployment rates than the previous recession in the last several years, and every inflation has had higher inflation. We've got to get that tilt out of the society.
Would it be fair to say, though, that a fundamental difference is the Germans are more deeply fearful of a return to inflation, having had the horrifying experience between the wars especially? We tend to be more afraid of recession turning into depression.
I think there is something in it, and in particular in Germany a government would have to fear very much in their electoral prospects if they went into such an election period with a high inflation rate. But there's another important difference.
We fear unemployment.
You fear
more
unemployment.
Than inflation, it seems.
Yeah, well, unemployment is feared with us too, but inflation is just as much feared. But there's another difference. Namely, once you have got into that escalating inflation, where every time the base, the plateau is higher, it's extremely difficult to get out of it. You must avoid getting into that now. That's a very cheap advice from me because you are there already. But we have for the last 15, 20 years, always studied foreign experiences and told ourselves we never must get into this vicious circle. Once you are in, it takes a long time to get out of it. That is what I'm preaching now, that we should avoid at all costs to get again into this vicious circle as we had it already in 73, 74. It took us also 4 years to get out of it, although we were only at 8% inflation. 4 years to get down to 3%. So
yes.
Now you have, I think, the question whether you can do it in a gradualist way over many, many years, or whether you don't need a sort of shock treatment.
The film showed it took the Japanese, what, 4 years?
5 years.
5 years.
5 years.
Bob, one of my
some
greatest concerns is that we haven't suffered enough yet. Most of the nations that have finally got their inflation...
Speech, I can tell you.
Well, I'm not running for office, Clarence. Most countries that finally got their inflation under control had 20, 30% or worse inflation. Germany had much worse, and the public supports them. We live in a democracy, and we're getting constituencies that gain from inflation. If you look at people that own real estate, they've done very well. And how can we get there without going through even more pain? And I doubt that we will.
If you ask who are the constituencies that have benefited most from inflation, there are no doubt. It is the homeowners, but it's also the congressmen who have been able to vote higher spending without having to vote higher taxes. They have, in fact,
right.
Congress has in fact voted for inflation, but you have never had a congressman on record to that effect. It's the government civil servants who have their own salaries are indexed and tied to inflation. They have a retirement benefit, a retirement pension that's tied to inflation. They qualify, a large fraction of them, for Social Security as well, which is tied to inflation. So that the beneficial...
Labor contracts that are...
labor
and many
contracts.
pricing things that are
But
tied
the
to
one
inflation.
thing that isn't tied to inflation, and here I want to come back and ask why Congress has been so bad in this area, is our taxes. It has been impossible to get Congress to index the tax system so that you don't have the present effect, where every 1% increase in inflation pushes people up into higher brackets and forces them to pay higher taxes.
Well, as you know,
Why
I'm an
hasn't-
advocate of
I
that.
know you are.
Some countries do that, of course.
Oh,
Canada
of course,
does it.
yeah.
It indexes the index.
And I went up to Canada on a little weekend seminar program on indexing and came back an advocate of indexing, because I found out that the people who are delighted with indexing are the taxpayers, because as the inflation rate goes up, their tax level either maintains its same level or goes down. The people who are the people who are very unhappy with it are the people who have to plan government spending, because it is reducing the amount of money that the government has rather than watching it go up by 10 or 12 billion. You get a little dividend to spend in this country, the bureaucrats do every year. But the politicians are unhappy with it too, as Dr. Friedman points out, because, you see, the politicians don't get to vote a tax reduction. It happens automatically.
Yeah.
And so you can't go back and in a praiseworthy way tell your constituents that I am for you, I voted the tax reduction. And I think we ought to be able to index the tax system so that that tax reduction is automatic, rather than have what we've had in the past, and that is an automatic increase in the taxes. And the politicians say, well, we're sorry about inflation, but you're right.
Well, I want to go and make a very different point. I sit here and berate you and you as government officials and so on, but I understand very well that the real culprit are not the politicians, are not the central bankers, but it's I and my fellow citizens. I always say to people when I talk about this, if you want to know who's responsible for inflation, look in the mirror. It's not because of the way you spend your money. Inflation doesn't arise because you got consumers who are spendthrift. They've always been spendthrift. It doesn't arise because you've got the businessmen who are greedy. They've always been greedy. Inflation arises because we as citizens have been asking you as politicians to perform an impossible task. We've been asking you to spend somebody else's money on us, but not to spend our money on anybody else.
You don't want us to cut back those dollars for education, right?
And therefore, well, no, I do.
We've already had a program on that.
We've already had a program on that, and there's no viewer of these programs who will be any doubt about my position.